Hello, this is a PowerPoint presentation introducing the merits of applied biofeedback. I will be reading the contents on each slide, adding a bit of additional information as we move along. So, without further ado, I present to you Overcoming the Confines of Mind. In this presentation, we'll be covering galvanic skin response meters, what they are and where they came from. We'll look at brain cortexes and the activation of the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS for short, and then at some fundamental data on how brain activity relates to our conscious experience. We'll pass through emotions, touch on programming and reality, how our past considerations shape future experience, and lastly, how we can go about inspecting a mind's contents by way of beneficial applications of GSR technology. Galvanic skin response meters are basically modified Wheatstone bridges that measure changes in skin resistance. They have been around in some form for over a century and have been used by such notable psychologists as Carl Jung, who published Studies in Word Analysis in 1906 documenting GSR word assessment, which will be described later. GSR meters have also been mentioned in some textbooks as early as in 1926 in Mary Collins and James Drever's textbook Experimental Psychology. So in truth, the use of biofeedback devices, or at least that idea, is nothing new. However, GSR devices have become increasingly complex, affordable, and accessible, as is suggested by this screenshot from a digital meter. So, what do GSR meters do? Well, put simply, they measure changes in resistance to a tiny current passed through the body. And this change in resistance has been associated with the activation of the autonomic nervous system, specifically the limbic system's stress response reaction. Think of the fight or flight response. In fact, our brain's limbic system structures are responsible for processing emotion and memory. So let's take a closer look. Several brain structures make up the limbic system. The hypothalamus regulates pulse, blood pressure, breathing, and arousal in response to emotional realities. The amygdala is well known for its connection to rage, aggression, and our fear response, including anticipatory reactions. The hippocampal structures are involved with the conversion of short-term memory into long-term memory, and the thalamus regulates the flow of all of this information and more to the cerebral cortex. Of course, activity in the cerebral cortex directly correlates to conscious experience and thoughtful reflection. It's also worth keeping in mind that the neural structures of the limbic system directly adjoin others. For example, the cingulate gyrus is responsible for focusing attention on emotionally significant events and for associating memories to pain. The basal ganglia is associated with repetitive behaviors, reward experiences, and focusing attention on emotionally relevant stimuli. Also directly connected to the brain's limbic system is the ventral tegmental area, also known as the VTA. And this includes dopamine pathways associated with pleasure and whose neurotransmitter receptors are primary targets of several psychotropic drugs utilized in allopathic forms of psychotherapeutic practice. Okay, so these structures, admittedly some more than others, play a major role in the arousal of our autonomic nervous system. Emotional arousal affects every major organ of the body through a series of nerves and hormones. The fight or flight response exemplifies the speed at which this reaction can cascade throughout our body. We experience a racing heart, sweaty palms, that nervous feeling in our stomach, but the chemical pathways involved in brain response to stress are actually quite complex, and we do know quite a bit about them. However, on a more pragmatic level, we can study what stimuli activates the ANS. And this so-called reactive mind has been studied by many researchers now for quite some time. For example, it was found back in the 50s that Effectively charged words evoked arousal to the degree they had been psychiatrically judged most personally meaningful. In other words, words representing significant concepts or that remind us of traumatic events activate the autonomic nervous system, and this is quite easily demonstrated with a GSR meter. In fact, in addition to words, smells, sights, sounds, tastes, and all combinations of sensory inputs can trigger memories with their emotional content. We've all experienced emotions associated with some memories, both positive and negative emotions, and specific neural events correlate with these effects and also determine how we process them as they surface. So let's take a bird's eye view of how our brain processes information. Since we don't cut into healthy people's brains to document the effects of brain damage on experience, most of what we know about brain cortexes comes from observing victims of brain damage. Neurobiological analysis of individuals living with brain damage demonstrates how specific brain structures contribute to our behavior. And perhaps the most well-known example of this principle is good old Phineas Gage. Now, he had an accident with a railroad spike, which you'll see in a second here. But before his brain injury, he was described in terms generally considered positive, the kind of guy you'd want working for you: balanced, smart, energetic, persistent, and socially capable. An unanticipated explosion sent the railroad spike through Phineas's skull, physically damaging his brain. Lo and behold, his behavior changed markedly. He became irreverent, grossly profane, fitful, impatient, and socially awkward. While still capable of completing most tasks, his personality changed as a result of significant brain damage. Thus, understanding what parts of the brain are active and when can help us to understand how we come to respond to others and the world in the ways we do. Before we go any further, let's quickly clarify some terms. For the purposes of this presentation, the brain is the physical organ in the head, while the mind is our conscious experience of that brain's diverse modes and operations. The spirit is, at least in principle, awareness existing outside of the brain. And whether spirits or a true brain-mind dualism exists, or whether awareness can exist outside of the brain, we can only know and distinguish between these possibilities because we are conscious. While human consciousness involves the whole brain, conscious deliberation and thinking in general corresponds to activity in the frontal and prefrontal cortexes, the parts of the brain capable of thinking about thinking. But our conscious experience, no matter how seamless it seems to be, is an amalgam of several neural cortexes funneling processed information into the neocortex. And while we are unaware of which computational center in our heads is contributing at each moment to our experience of each moment, we are nonetheless aware of each moment. We are equally oblivious to the specific content being processed by each neural cortex, the specific areas of the brain whose respective activity allows for every sensation and their integration. In fact, it is the integration of each cortex's small program, if you will, that results in a cohesive, conscious experience. So the part we are aware of is really just the surface of deeper activity. Here, in the surface of our mind, is where we house reasons and explanations for our problems, upsets, desires, and every consideration born of reflecting upon experience. Yet the unconscious activity, foundational to such reflection, rages on. We are unconscious of the supporting depths of our mind, the actual sources of most problems, upsets, desires, etc. And when pressure builds beneath our reasonableness, nascent raw reality can rear its ugly head. Yet each of these eruptions began as a small imbalance deep within. You don't have to understand the pressure dynamics of hurricane formation to know that eventually people overreact to little things, exploding like volcanoes. Emotions are like ripples in our consciousness. When we are quiet and still within, our minds reflect the truth of the world around us. But often this equanimity is perturbed, distorting our reflections upon the world. Often, other small impacts follow, until at last we are riding on waves of emotion. It looks like fun, and it can be, feeling strong emotions, the significance of self-righteous anger, the pride of leaving losers in the dust, successful domination, that kind of thing. But, lest we forget, such waves carry with them dangers of their own. The surfer here, for example, crushed 2 vertebrae riding this very wave. And these waves can form quite easily, sweeping us into emotional realities we cannot easily get away from. We grow accustomed to our realities, believing, mistakenly, that our understanding of the world is the world itself. And perhaps this is one interesting part of it. How we come to build realities that bind us to our emotional reactions, to waves of cascading emotion or energy motion. To understand this process, consider the idea of chains of related conceptions. Any conception we have about the world began with observation, which, over time, resulted in understanding from which we predicted or hypothesized the effect of considered causes. Ideally, we then observed, refined our understanding, made new predictions, observed again, and on and on and on. So in our brain, or mind if you prefer, we hold these understandings and derive from them various beliefs and computations, which together we might refer to simply as programming. And it is through this programming we tend to weigh all future understanding. So, it's a loop. Increasingly with age, we come to know new things by comparing them to what is already known. Naturally, our understandings lead to a series of expectations, which orient our future observations. Thus, does the glass through which we view the world grow dark, as we respond to stimuli as symbolic of internalized struggles. When we decide the world is a certain way, we order our experiences accordingly. What people seek, they tend to find, whether it is actually there or not. Robert Anton Wilson wrote that humanity is the symbol-using class of life, and those who control symbols control us. Many understand this intimately, such as politicians who present themselves as symbols of good change, what people want, and their opponents as symbolic of everything presently wrong. Well, right or wrong, the following few slides will develop the idea that our interpretation of events proceeds according to the words with which we order them. So your present understanding is, for all intents and purposes, synonymous with what is. And when someone comes along with a different story that disagrees with your own, you must somehow account for this difference. Recall the cycle by which we continually refine our understanding. And now let's list a few factors affecting and disrupting this cycle. Fear, strong beliefs, emotional needs, that is, needing something to be so, significances, and general emotional overwhelm can each cut our capacity for honest confrontation of our surroundings. To mitigate having to confront such contradicting data, we ask a series of weaning questions. Does it fit with my current beliefs? What do the authorities I recognized, whether book or person, think of it? Is it compatible with what I want? Is the source of the information respected? And ultimately, is it compatible with my current programming? How do we reconcile incompatible programming when what we know doesn't match the what is around us? Well, for starters, let's simply admit that what fits is far more comfortable. When a square peg doesn't fit through a round hole, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with either the peg or the hole, but we do like it when we find a puzzle piece that fits into the ordered puzzle we've already pieced together. In a general sense, then, reality is harmony of order. Borrowing a few words, in Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant stipulated that perceptions are organized sensations and conceptions are organized perceptions. Our conceptions of reality are made of grouped perceptions, which in turn are comprised of clumped sensations. So, we order small bits into bigger bits, and those into even bigger bits. Schopenhauer began his classic work, The World as Will and Idea, with the candid opening, "The world is my idea," meaning that the world is to him, and to each of us respectively, merely our idea of it. We respond to the world as we conceive it to be. The vessels of these conceptions are individual words. Now, feel free to pause this presentation if you need a minute to digest this, or perhaps to cross-reference it with other information sources. Words function as monikers or placeholders for common experience. This is what makes communication possible. We use words to symbolize meaning and language to share and compare experiences. We mentally categorize according to our ability to differentiate. We name people and things to set them apart from one another, to create space in our minds between them. The connection between words and reality is the matter of mind, and the domain of Alfred Korzybski's study of general semantics, which looks at how our understandings map to reality. Okay, a crash course in general semantics. Maps represent a territory, but they aren't the territory they represent. Of maps, Korzybski said the following. He said, two important characteristics of maps should be noticed. A map is not a territory it represents, but, if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness. So let's whittle this down a bit. Words are file names. Overlapping meanings get their own words, and we define words with still other words, and these interrelating differentiations form webs of reality. So, what's this all mean? What is the bottom line? We've seen that content is grouped into interrelated files. When we encounter something similar to our past, we're reminded of our past, which is to say that when we encounter similarity to our past, we, to use a computing metaphor, load the relevant files. And obviously, emotional content can be stored in those files. This is the key to understanding most chronic thoughts and emotions. Anything associated with a file can trigger its emotional content. Using a GSR meter, it is possible to monitor degrees of autonomic nervous system activation in response to specific experiences and, by extension, to any words representing those experiences. So, for example, a GSR meter can measure negative emotional content within a file, for example, dad. Or perhaps an individual has an even larger file on mom, with whom let's say, resides more unresolved emotional baggage. Ergo, a stronger emotional reaction results in a larger read on a GSR meter. In fact, autonomic nervous system arousal is proportionate to the aggregate intensity of dysresolution. And this includes trauma, confusion, disagreement, chronic experiences, problems, and other emotional content as well. Notice too that this phenomenon can be clearly observed with words representing categories around which many people rally. In fact, it is upon these charged files that much of our strong conceptions of reality are built. Additionally, charged words can clump together, their association resulting in amassed concepts that become, at least in the minds of believers, one and the same thing. So to use a word in the previous slide, consider marijuana. Here is a short list of some associations to the word marijuana gleaned from a few recent conversations to illustrate the semantics-oriented process of reality building. To person A, marijuana is release from unwanted chronic experience. It's beneficial, it's safer than alcohol, and it's natural. And when another enforce contrary associations, which is to say another person strongly disagreed with these associations to marijuana, I witnessed person A reacting to, and this was the file name for him, he was reacting to the ignorant prejudice of other people, which, lo and behold, is a charged item for many people. Contrariwise, in person B's mental map, marijuana is clearly linked to addiction, to a wasted life, to the useless potheads he knew in community college, and, quite simply, to the fact that it's just plain illegal, and that makes it wrong. Now, person B has, on more than one occasion, also regarded disagreeing claims to what he says marijuana really is to his associations as, yep, proof of ignorant prejudice. So let's take another example to further illustrate this. Consider the differing associations to the word Republican. And here is a thin sample of those words gleaned from a few conversations I've had with a couple of my friends recently. To person C, Republicans are rich, they're corrupt, they're elitist, and they're uncaring. To think otherwise demonstrates, to person C, remarkable ignorant prejudice. Person C regards those who disagree with this assessment as either incapable or unwilling to confront the facts of the matter. Now, person D would say the same thing of person C, that he was incapable or unwilling to confront the facts of the matter, because he maintains that the obvious truth is that Republicans are principled, they're fiscally responsible, they're moral, and they're charitable. Person D thinks that person C's grasp of Republicans is a load of malarkey, which I have been told by person E is code for ignorant prejudice. Now, this isn't to say that everyone regards all disagreeing viewpoints as ignorant and prejudiced. Rather, the point here is that several individuals can experience comparable brain activation while disagreeing fundamentally with one another. To understand the anatomy of mental machinery allows a GSR professional to take these emotionally charged webs of collapsed meanings apart and free other people from stuck points of view. None of this is new. Carl Jung published similar data within that earlier mentioned 1906 article entitled Studies in Word Analysis, in which he found that GSR meters were useful in assessing conflictive emotional content associated with word lists, and also that the charged content of a file will cause a corresponding activation of the autonomic nervous system and therefore a needle read. Enter allopathic psychiatry. Marijuana is relatively tame compared to many psychotropic drugs routinely prescribed to adults and young children alike. Much has been said about this, and much remains to be said, but the point here is that from alcohol and marijuana to Xanax and Risperdal, whether the dealer is on the street or in a doctor's office, drugs can provide a release from chronic emotions. They help people unplug and get away. So, when life re-stimulates a memory and the emotional charge associated with past events gets trudged up, the magic pill response is to inhibit natural brain function. Then again, if what I've been describing here in this presentation is accurate, then one alternative to using controlled substances to dampen the symptoms of unhandled mental anguish is to handle the actual causes of mental anguish. Since free speech on health and healing remains limited, I urge you to see a doctor for the official reasons why using powerful drugs pushed by international pharmaceutical conglomerates is a good idea. Or consider a different approach. Many have found GSR meters to be useful and accurate in the hands of trained professionals. Introducing Bioclearing, the act of resolving chronic reactive thoughts and emotions through guided self-inspection techniques. For more information, please visit my GSR Bioclearing resource at gsrmystic.wordpress.com. Thanks for watching.